Welcome back to As Promised. I hope you had a great week. My week was up and down. It was interesting. Everybody should go and watch Inside Out 2. That film is for adults. The way it looks at different emotions in the mind center and the way those emotions try to narrate or dictate the way in which we live our life, I think is just like the perfect highlight as to what we're also exploring on Super Brain through this podcast, but just also in a way in which you can manage your emotions or at least observe your emotions. There was a line where Joy said to Sadness, "Wherever I go, you go too." And listen, me, I love an animation film because they make me cry. But that part, and it was like in the first 10 minutes as well. So my eyes were welling up. So thank you to my friend that took me. I appreciate you. You're an absolute gem. So shout out to you. Okay, let's talk about anxiety. Before we dive right in, I want to say how much influence repetition has in regards to anxiety, fears, and even what we were looking at before in terms of depression. The repetition part of what is happening in our minds that relate to our brains is also what reinforces the beliefs that we have, and that therefore manifests in the way in which we move, our actions, our words, how we relate to each other. Repetition, remembering repetition and the influence that it has, because that's going to get us quickly or quicker at least to a place where we find openings in the mind brain connection and dialogue so that we can intercept anxiety, observe it, and therefore alchemize it in hopes to be a better, more resilient, more open, more balanced person, but also so that we can relate that to our art and allow our art to experience balance as well. So, anxiety creates a false picture of the world, piling on things to be afraid of that are in fact harmless. The mind adds fear. If the mind can undo the perception of fear, the danger will vanish. Easier said than done, obviously, but we're here to practice, we're here to get solutions. So let's keep reading. Because when I saw the vanish part, I was like, that's techie, because you're making a very, very high promise. But, well, might as well try. Solution based, babe. Okay. Fear creates paralysis and misery. For people who suffer from free floating anxiety, the short term solution is a chemical fix, tranquilizers. And I wonder if that also relates to different like drugs as well. Free floating means the thing you fear is not a specific threat. So if the fear is free floating, if the anxiety is free floating, making a high promise that it can vanish is techie because you don't even know what you're afraid of. And this is why big shout out again to Inside Out 2, because one of the main emotions was anxiety. And they showed what anxiety could do to you and the body in the most brilliant way. So homework, go watch Inside Out 2. It says drugs don't cure mood disorders. Just as being sad is universal, while depression is abnormal and unhealthy, fear is universal, while free floating anxiety gnaws away at the soul. Nothing is more unwelcome than anxiety. Okay, so what does universal mean? Universal means relating to or done by all people or things in the world, applicable to all cases is what universal means. And I guess this is why it was like that moment in Inside Out 2 where Joy took Sadness by the hand and was like, of course you can come this place with me. Where I go, you go also. I understand why this book would say that sadness is universal as opposed to depression is not, because sadness can't exist without the happiness. It's the yin and the yang. And that's why I'm like, we're on a journey to balance as opposed to just being 100 all the time, just always be happy, being up, because that's delusional. You can't stay up there forever. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know that you're happy. It has to fluctuate. There has to be some kind of flow within your emotions, within your living experience in order to evolve and grow. So it says sadness is universal and therefore fear is universal. life cannot exist without fear. If life cannot exist without fear, that therefore also means that we can use fear in different ways. As we know, we can do it, but do it scared, or we're scared, but I'm going to try anyway because there might be this idea of failure. Sometimes I feel fear and I ask myself, what exactly are you afraid of? For me, it could be fear of embarrassment. It could be I'm afraid that people are going to think, oh, she's doing too much. But none of that matters. Whatever people think doesn't actually matter as long as we're being generous of spirit and of service to the world, right? It's like that quote we've all heard: fear means false evidence appearing real. And I wonder what the false evidence is. Is it external stimuluses, internal stimuluses? Like, what is the false evidence and why are we paralyzed by it? Why does it stop flow? Why does it make us stagnant? Which can also make your art stagnant if you're too scared to be bold, be courageous, be curious, do things that you know might not be received in the capacity in which you want them to be received. But that's actually just life. Like, on a day-to-day basis, the actions that we do, we hope for a particular outcome. But often, more than not, the outcome is entirely different to that which we hoped for. But within that is an opportunity to make it work, find the silver lining, say, okay, this isn't what I wanted, but let's see what I can get from this, which immediately changes the thought pattern of, I knew it was going to go wrong from the start. I never get anything right, or all of these other self defeating, self destructive thought patterns. And I mean, even the people that we admire and we champion, they do things boldly. And even if it is not how we would have done it, they did it. It goes back to that saying, or is it an analogy where there are dreamers and then there are doers? Something about stopping self before doing is the matter of concern here. Anxiety stops you from getting that shit done. And that's why we have to investigate it, challenge it, so that we do what we were called to do. Once you become anxious in a perversive sense, as happens, for example, to chronic worriers, the whole brain gets involved. Fear is targeted and specific. Anxiety is pervasive and mysterious. People who suffer from it don't know why. Pervasive means especially of an unwelcome influence or physical effect, spreading widely throughout an area or a group of people. This free floating anxiety can be that infectious. Like, it can just infect a space, it can infect self and cause you paralysis in many parts of your life. That has to be investigated. That must feel like imprisonment, especially if you're an artist, because how do you get your art across? How do you share your art with the world? You have to be bold and extremely open, at least to whatever it is that the external, those that are experiencing your art, bring to you. This doesn't mean to say that there are no anxious artists. I'm sure that they are. The desire is to help relieve the anxiety. To find the solution, they must learn not to fight the fear, but to stop identifying with the fears. There are two things in this sentence: learn not to fight and stop identifying with the fears. I think with the learn not to fight, it's really important to continually try and encourage self to move away from blame or shame or guilt. We just get so distracted within the conflict of self that I think causes more anxiety in the long run. And therefore, you start to build your identity around that anxiety, around that fear. So, in learning not to fight, doing the first part of the sentence should hopefully make the second part of the sentence much easier. We hope they could therefore be introduced more flow. This was who I was yesterday. This is who I am today. This is who I might be tomorrow. Less about this is what I believe. And it has to stay like that in order for the structures that I have built to feel valid in my thinkings, in my morals, in my beliefs, and in my actions to persist. If we just accept that there is constant change to everything, and we find a way to repeat that to self above anything, then we can really start to identify, not identify, we can really start to explore and investigate where the anxiety might stem from, as opposed to being under the hand of the anxiety and feeling helpless within it. In its positive natural state, fear dissipates after you run away from, say, the saber-toothed tiger, or you kill the hypothetical woolly mammoth. There is no psychological component. In its negative, pervasive state, fear lingers. Its stickiness has a number of aspects. So, how anxiety becomes sticky. The same worry keeps returning. Repetition makes the fear response stick in the brain. The fear is convincing. When you believe in the voice of fear, it takes over. The fear stirs up a memory. What you fear resembles something bad in your past, which brings back the old response. Fear leads to silence. From shame or guilt, you don't speak your fear, so it festers. Fear feels bad, and you shove the pain out of sight, but repressed feelings endure. What you resist persists. Fear is crippling. You feel too weak to do anything about it. It says earlier we talked about the depressed response in terms of behavior that turns into a habit. That's one way to describe when it comes to our emotions, the stickiness of our emotions. The points we made out about how depression turns into a habit are worth going back to, since they also apply to anxiety. What we are adding here is the multidimensional aspect. Fear reaches out with many tentacles, and every attachment is unhealthy. To undo fear, we need to break its reality down. Each part, taken on its own, is manageable. You can dismantle it for the simple reason that you are at the center. So now we're dismantling fear as opposed to the anxiety, but fear can be used as a good thing. Or, in fact, you can't exist without the fear. It's learning how to not allow the fear to invade and therefore stay. And I think that's what manifests as anxiety. That's what alchemizes itself to anxiety. Okay, so that makes sense why we break down the fear and not break down the anxiety. It's breaking down the root of the cause as opposed to the manifestation in reference to the root. Okay. It says, the same worry keeps returning. Repetition makes the fear response stick in the brain. Repetition deepens the rut that keeps any response fixed. Going back to right at the start of this episode, repetition is what is the biggest influence here, or one of the biggest influences. So as soon as we can use that, as soon as we can just identify that, isolate that, and say, okay, I need to acknowledge what I am repeating to myself, we're already 10 steps ahead. We're inside. Repetition is never simple. It tells a little story here. Children who live with angry parents can predict fairly well when to expect another blow up. The same children will find, usually many years later, that the abuse that their angry parents dole out affected them badly. In the case of anxiety, they internalized the repetition. You turn into the abuser delivering the same be afraid message over and over. And that's to self. That's self abuse. But unconscious self abuse, I should say. Because one thing I think that is very important is that we don't lay blaming self, because those emotions are also just as difficult to get out of, only keep you stuck in a place of I've caused this on myself. I'm not good enough. I don't know how to. You start to blame self, and that you just can't get out of that until you actually do the real in-depth work of talking to yourself in a way that is elevating, affirming yourself, empowering yourself. But even that feels icky if you've literally been conditioned to not think you're worth anything, which is a lot. Some people subconsciously put self down. Some parents subconsciously put their children down. Those subconscious narratives can actually rewire the brain, especially if you're a child and you haven't even built up the awareness that you can speak to self. You can have a self-conscious dialogue that builds and empowers self. Often it just sounds like being self-conscious or being aware of self-aware is a negative. I guess there's more exploring to do within that as well. It says it helps you realize that you are playing this double role of abuser and abused. Chronic worriers can't see it. They repeat the same worries. What if I didn't lock the house? What if I lose my job? What if my child is on drugs? And actually, they think they are being helpful. The irritated reactions of family and friends don't end the delusion. If anything, the worrier steps up their worry because no one else is paying attention. It's their responsibility then to worry for everyone else. The mind, trapped inside itself, can't look far enough to see that chronic worry does no good. It doesn't recognize the repeated, obsessive assault of fear as negative. It becomes a kind of fix. You endure a little nagging pain in order to ward off huge threats that could bring disaster. A kind of magical thinking is involved also. The warrior is chanting a kind of incantation that is supposed to keep the threat away. If I worry about losing all my money, maybe it won't happen. To end the influence of repetition, awareness must come into play. That's what I mean by becoming self-conscious, becoming self-aware. Because if repetition is the biggest influence, and you're not even aware enough, you're not conscious enough that you're repeating these sentences to self, it just digs the hole deeper and deeper and deeper and makes it harder, more of a challenge. It just makes it more of a challenge to get out of those repetitive thoughts. You have to wait for the openings. You have to look for the openings, or at least be present enough to see the openings, acknowledge the openings when they come, to break the repetitive thought pattern. Whew, language. But here are some thoughts that you can think consciously that will help break up that repetitive thought pattern. I'm doing it again. I feel bad when I worry. I need to stop at this moment. The future is unknown. Worrying about it is pointless. I'm doing myself no good. This isn't me going, I have no worries. I've completed all levels of Super Brain. Look at me. I know. I am literally making these episodes for myself to remind myself that there are always openings. So my fear is rooted in the fact that if people know me or my perception of who I am, it leaves me vulnerable to attack. But that is not a real thing. That is not a tangible idea. Whatever attack means, I need to investigate. Whatever vulnerability means, I need to investigate. Whatever being overexposed means, I need to investigate, because all of these things keep me isolated. It keeps me hidden from that which I want to do, which is serve, be of service with my art and be of service with myself. As artists, we're all isolated until we often get to come together and create a project. And then we go back off into our isolations, which has kind of got even more intense in this day and age, because you could end up doing your self tapes by yourself. There's now apps where you can record your own lines and repeat them back by yourself. You spend so much time reading scripts, going to the theater, watching films, just being isolated, that thoughts you aren't even aware are happening are repeating themselves. And then it makes it even more difficult to go into those collective spaces and be honestly, truly open enough to create the art. These are just experiences that all form part of the story that is you. So we have to let go of this idea that these thoughts, these self-destructive, you always have something to share. Your experience is valid and it's necessary and must be brought forward. But if you are stopping yourself because of these thought patterns, you think you might be in control. It says by bringing the same warnings to mind over and over, one might feel they had a kind of control over the fear. But people who are stuck in self-destructive worrying know the old pattern doesn't work from the get-go. You have to break out of it. And you break out of it not by learning to stop the mental process, but by overriding it with an emerging awareness. One that says, this fear isn't real. I'm the one creating it, which is true. But also, you can always decide that which it is that you want to do. It says here, the anxious person became aware that they were abusing themselves through self induced fear, having been the abused and then becoming the abuser, all to self as well. That literally blows my mind because it's like the only person that we are responsible for, the only person that we can measure ourselves up to, the only person that we must demand every day a better version of is ourselves. So if we know all of those things and we're also causing ourselves abuse or we're abusing self, it just feels like conflict. And that doesn't allow progression. There's conflict in the body, there's conflict in the mind. It says fear is convincing. When you believe the voice of fear, it takes over. If you think that something is true, it sticks with you. This goes without saying. We all want to believe the words, I love you, if they come from the right person. Being convincing isn't the same as being true. Anxiety is the most convincing emotion of all, in part because evolution has hardwired the brain to react with fight or flight response. If you're in a battle staring into the mouth of a cannon, your racing heart tells you in no certain terms what you must do. But when the condition is free floating anxiety, the voice of fear isn't telling you the truth. It is using the power of fear to convince you, even when you have nothing to be afraid of. Detachment has healing abilities. If you can say to your fear, I don't believe you, I don't accept you, its power to convince will diminish. Here, the mind must lead the brain. If the brain is exposed to a terrible outside event, it reacts with fear. But pictures of that event or any other strong stimuluses that brings it to mind will evoke the same reaction. Reflex reactions speak to us, they have a voice. The mind exists to sort out the real from the unreal. When the mind is leading the brain out of anxiety, it has thoughts like this: nothing bad is happening to me, I can handle the situation, because we can. Worst case scenarios are extremely unlikely to occur. This isn't one. I am not alone. I can turn for help if I need it. That's a loud one. We really don't be sharing our fears with each other. I think we share our complaints more, but we don't get to the root of our fears because that means we might have to ask for help. And asking for help comes with its own guilt and shame, which relates back to the start of this episode of useless emotions, emotions that keep us stagnant. My anxiety is just a feeling, is another thought. Does this feeling make sense? That is such a good one, because I wonder if we can also say, does this thought make sense? Just to like intercept it before it even takes root. Because sometimes I'll have these thoughts, I call them intrusive thoughts, where I'm like, that was left. Where did that come from? I'm like, why am I thinking that? What is that? And then often the fear would go away. And the last one is, things are okay and I am okay right now. In this moment, in the present moment, things are okay and I am okay, which is such a helpful thought because it calms you. It calms you. All you can ever deal with is what is happening right now in this moment. By putting the voice of fear in its place, you make it less convincing. Each time you do it, repetition comes to your aid instead of undermining you. Every realistic appraisal makes the next one easier. Appraisal means an act of assessing something or someone. So that sentence reads, every realistic act of assessing something or someone makes the next one easier. So every realistic act of assessing a thought makes the next assessment of the thought easier. Being present with your thoughts, observing them, and waiting for an opening. And then once you have the opening, seizing it. And once you appraise and you think that thought, which is an act of assessing it, it's not necessarily, you don't have to be there yet where you completely override it or you change the thought entirely, but you can assess it by just asking, is that true? Do I actually believe that of myself? Do I actually believe that of the scenario? This can always feel daunting, especially when it feels like nobody is talking about it. Nobody's talking about the absolute crushing intensity of anxiety. Everyone just talks about how it's not real, or don't worry, we'll get over it, or just go and take some medicine and stuff. And it's like, but what if you don't want to take medicine? You are on any prescribed medication, do not stop it because you hear me chatting about this. This is all just explorations, hopeful explorations that can lead to solutions via books that I read on these subjects. This is not a diagnosis, and it's not for you to stop taking medication if you're on medication. It's simply for you to ask questions, investigate self. So I feel like that was a lot. It could be big thoughts, but we love big thoughts. I think from this episode, one thing that I'd love myself to take from it, and anybody that is listening, is the act of repetition. What are you repeating to self? And sometimes just catching those thoughts. What is it that you've repeated? Why have you said that to yourself? Why am I saying that to myself? If it's not in alignment with who you see or wish or desire yourself to be, the person that you wish to be, shift it, move it, flow with it, and grow with it into a new place. Repetition. That's what we're thinking on today, this week. Anyway, I hope you have a great week. We'll continue investigating anxiety next week. More solutions, because we're solution based babes. And thank you for listening. Even if it's just going to be myself and I listen in a couple of years, maybe next year, you never know. I might need it in a day or two. Who knows?